The hall looked like something out of a dream. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling, shining softly over round tables covered in white cloth. Gentle music played in the background while waiters moved carefully between guests, carrying trays of sparkling drinks. The air smelled of fresh flowers and expensive perfume. Laughter floated from every corner of the room. She stood near the back wall, holding a tray with both hands. Her uniform was neat but simple. She had tied her hair back tightly, hoping to look professional and not draw attention to herself. This was only her second evening working at events like this. She needed the extra money, so she agreed when the hotel called her for temporary work. Around her, the guests looked confident and comfortable, dressed in shining suits and long, elegant dresses. Many of them spoke loudly about business deals, travel plans, and future investments. She listened quietly as she walked past them, careful not to interrupt. She had learned that when people saw staff, they rarely noticed the person, only the service. In one corner of the hall stood a large black grand piano. It was polished so well that the lights reflected on its surface. No one was playing it. It was there mostly for decoration, though sometimes at events like this, a hired musician would perform soft background music. Tonight, the piano sat silent. At one of the center tables, a group of young men sat together. They looked relaxed and amused by everything around them. They had already finished several drinks and were laughing louder than the others. One of them leaned back in his chair and scanned the room, clearly bored. "That piano has been sitting there all night," he said, loud enough for the table to hear. "What's the point if no one's playing it?" Another shrugged. "Maybe they forgot to hire someone." They laughed again. Just then, she walked past their table with her tray. One of them looked up at her. His eyes moved from her simple uniform to the tray in her hands. Something playful crossed his face. "Excuse me," he called out. She stopped politely. "Yes, sir. Do you know how to play the piano?" he asked with a teasing smile. The other men at the table chuckled softly, already sensing where this was going. She blinked, surprised by the question. "No, sir," she answered quickly, lowering her eyes. It was easier to say no. It avoided attention. "Oh, come on," another one said, grinning. "It can't be that hard. Just press a few keys. We need some entertainment." She shifted her weight slightly, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm working right now," she said gently. "I should stay with my duties." "That's exactly why you should do it," the first one replied, laughing. "It'll be fun. Just for a minute." Their voices grew louder. A few nearby guests began to turn their heads. The mood at the table was playful, but it carried an edge that made her uncomfortable. She could feel eyes starting to rest on her. "We promise we won't judge," one of them added, though his smirk suggested the opposite. She forced a small polite smile, hoping they would lose interest. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I don't think that's a good idea." But the teasing did not stop. "Are you scared?" one asked, raising an eyebrow. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Scared. She tightened her grip on the tray. She had faced harder things in life than a piano in a bright room. Still, this was different. This was public. This was a room full of strangers waiting for something to laugh at. "It's just a joke," another voice added. "Relax." A couple at a nearby table began whispering to each other, curious. The energy in the room shifted slightly. The soft background music felt quieter now. From across the hall, the event manager noticed the small crowd forming and started walking toward them, unsure of what was happening. She felt trapped between politeness and pride. If she refused again, they might mock her more. If she agreed, she risked embarrassing herself in front of everyone. "Go on," one of the men insisted. "We'll even clap for you." More laughter followed. Her heart began beating faster. She glanced at the piano. It looked bigger than before, almost intimidating under the lights. For a moment, she imagined walking away. She could simply excuse herself and disappear into the kitchen. But something inside her felt tired of shrinking. She slowly placed the tray on a nearby table. The small movement caught everyone's attention. The laughter softened into curious murmurs. "You're really going to do it?" one of the men said, surprised. She did not answer. Instead, she wiped her hands lightly against her uniform, trying to calm the slight trembling in her fingers. Each step toward the piano felt heavier than the last. The sound of her shoes against the floor seemed louder than it should have been. Conversations around the room began to fade as people sensed something unusual was about to happen. She reached the bench and stood beside it for a second. Up close, the piano looked even more beautiful. The smooth black surface reflected her face back at her. She barely recognized the serious expression staring back. Behind her, a few soft giggles could still be heard. She took a slow breath. In that breath lived memories. Late evenings in a small living room, soft lamplight, worn-out keys under her small childhood fingers. She remembered sitting beside someone who once guided her hands patiently, correcting her posture, telling her to listen to the music, not just play it. Those memories felt far away now, almost from another life. She gently sat down on the bench. The hall grew unusually quiet. Even the young men who had started the teasing were now leaning forward with interest. Her hands hovered above the keys. For a second, doubt rushed in. What if she forgot? What if her fingers shook too much? What if the sound came out wrong? She closed her eyes. The world outside faded. The whispers disappeared. The lights no longer mattered. There was only the piano. Her fingers lowered slowly and touched the first key. The sound that came out was soft but clear. It echoed lightly through the hall. A few people exchanged glances. She pressed another key, then another, building a simple melody. It was quiet at first, almost shy, just like her. At the table, one of the men smirked. "See?" he whispered to his friend. "Random notes." But then something changed. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing steadied. Her fingers began to move with more certainty. The notes connected smoothly, forming a familiar tune that flowed gently through the room. Conversations stopped completely now. The sound was no longer random, carried feeling. The melody grew deeper, richer. Her left hand joined with steady rhythm while her right hand danced lightly across higher keys. The piano responded beautifully, filling the hall with warm, emotional sound. One of the guests slowly lowered his glass, eyes fixed on her. The teasing table fell silent. She no longer looked like a nervous staff member forced into a joke. She looked calm, focused, almost transformed. The simple uniform did not matter anymore. Under the lights, she seemed confident, like she belonged there. The music rose and fell like a quiet story being told without words. It carried sadness, hope, and strength all at once. Some guests felt chills run down their arms. Others leaned closer, afraid to miss a single note. The event manager stopped walking and simply listened. The young men who had laughed earlier now stared at her in disbelief. Their playful expressions had faded into confusion. This was not a joke. This was something else. Her fingers moved faster now, but never rushed. Every note landed exactly where it needed to be. The hall that had once been filled with chatter was now wrapped in complete silence, broken only by the sound of the piano. No one could look away, and as the music continued to grow stronger, one thing became clear to everyone in that room. They had completely misjudged her. The prank they had started so casually was slowly turning into something unforgettable. The sound of the piano continued to float through the hall, but inside her mind, she was no longer standing in a bright hotel surrounded by strangers. The music carried her somewhere else. Somewhere smaller, quieter, and far more personal. Years ago, her world had looked very different. She grew up in a narrow street where houses stood close together and paint peeled from the walls. Their home was small, with a low ceiling and windows that let in more dust than light. In summer, the rooms felt warm and heavy. In winter, cold air slipped through tiny cracks near the door. But in one corner of that house stood something magical. An old upright piano. It was not shiny like the grand piano in the hotel. Its wood was scratched, and a few keys had faded from white to yellow. One key made a soft clicking sound when pressed. Another needed to be tapped twice before it responded. Still, to her, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Her father had bought it many years earlier from someone who no longer wanted it. He carried it home with the help of 2 neighbors. She still remembered how proud he looked that day, even though his shirt was soaked in sweat from the effort. "We don't have much," he had said with a gentle smile, placing his hand on top of the piano. "But we have music." At first, she only watched him play. In the evenings, after long hours of work, he would sit on the small wooden stool and press the keys softly. The house would fill with simple melodies. Sometimes the notes were cheerful. Other times they felt heavy and thoughtful. Even when money was tight and bills were stacked on the table, the music made the room feel lighter. She was barely tall enough to see over the keys when she first asked if she could try. Her fingers were small and unsure. The sound she made was uneven and loud. She quickly pulled her hands back, embarrassed. But he only laughed softly. "Music is not about being perfect," he told her. "It is about feeling." He began teaching her slowly, not with strict rules or thick books, but with patience. He showed her how to sit straight, how to let her fingers curve gently, how to listen carefully to each note. When she made mistakes, he did not scold her. He simply asked her to try again. Those evenings became their special time. While the rest of the neighborhood grew quiet, their small house filled with music. She practiced whenever she could. After school, before dinner, even early in the morning on weekends. Sometimes she would repeat the same small section again and again until her fingers remembered it without thinking. They could not afford formal lessons. There were no music schools nearby that they could pay for. Everything she learned came from those quiet hours beside him. Then life changed. One year, work became harder to find. The money that came into the house grew smaller and smaller. Worry settled into her parents' faces. Conversations became quieter, heavier. She noticed the way her father would sit at the table late at night, staring at numbers written on paper. The piano began to gather dust. Not because they stopped loving it, but because there were other things to think about. Groceries, rent, electricity. One evening, she came home from school and noticed strangers standing in their living room. They were examining the piano, pressing the keys, checking its condition. Her stomach tightened. She looked at her father. He avoided her eyes at first. Then he forced a small smile that did not reach his face. "We need to let it go for now," he said gently. For now. She wanted to argue. She wanted to beg. But she saw the tiredness in his eyes. She saw the way his hands trembled slightly when he spoke. The next morning, the corner of the room felt empty. The space where the piano once stood looked bigger but colder. That night was the first time she realized how quiet a house could feel without music. She tried to stay strong. She focused on school. She helped more around the house. But something inside her felt missing. A few months later, life grew even more difficult. Her father became ill. At first, they thought it was just exhaustion. But the weakness did not go away. Doctor visits became frequent. Medicines became expensive. The music did not return to their home. One evening, she sat beside him while he rested. The room was silent except for the faint sound of traffic outside. He looked at her with the same gentle expression he always had when she practiced. "Don't stop playing," he told her softly. She swallowed. "But we don't have a piano anymore." "You don't need one to remember," he replied. "The music is already inside you." Not long after that, he was gone. The house felt smaller than ever. The world felt heavier. For a long time, she avoided anything that reminded her of music. It hurt too much. Every melody brought back memories she was not ready to face. But music has a quiet way of returning. At school, there was an old keyboard in the auditorium. Most students ignored it. It was slightly out of tune and missing a few proper sounds. One afternoon, when the room was empty, she walked toward it slowly. She pressed one key. The sound was different from the piano she once knew, but it was still music. Her fingers hesitated at first, then began to move. Slowly, the melodies she had learned years ago came back to her. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but enough to remind her of who she used to be. From that day on, she would stay after school whenever she could. While others went home, she practiced quietly in the empty auditorium. No audience, no applause, no teasing. just her and the keys. Sometimes she imagined her father sitting nearby, listening. As years passed, responsibilities grew. She finished school and began working small jobs to help support her family. Music became something private again, a secret she carried inside. She never told her coworkers. She never mentioned it to friends. It felt too personal, too connected to memories she protected carefully. When she saw pianos in hotel lobbies or event halls, she would glance at them briefly, then look away. She told herself that part of her life was over. It belonged to childhood. Until tonight, as she sat at the grand piano in the bright hotel hall, those years rushed back into her hands. Every lesson, every correction, every late-night practice in the empty auditorium. The teasing voices behind her faded completely from her mind. They no longer mattered. What mattered was the music. Her fingers remembered the weight of the keys. They remembered how to move together, how to build emotion slowly, how to let the melody breathe. The grand piano felt different from the old upright she once knew. The sound was deeper, richer. Each note carried further across the room. But the feeling was the same. She was not playing for the guests. She was playing for the small girl who once sat beside her father. She was playing for the quiet evenings filled with hope. She was playing for the promise she had made without even realizing it, that she would never let the music inside her disappear. Back in the hall, guests sat frozen in their seats. Some leaned forward. Others held their breath. They did not know the story behind the notes. They did not know about the dusty upright piano, the small house, the sacrifices, or the quiet promise made years ago. To them, she was simply a staff member who had surprised them. But to herself, this moment was something much deeper. It was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about remembering who she was. And as the melody continued to rise through the air, strong and steady, she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt whole again. The last note of the melody from her childhood faded gently into the air, but her hands did not stop moving. Instead of pulling away from the keys, she let her fingers glide into the next passage. The sound grew fuller, stronger, more confident. It was no longer just a memory being played. It was something alive. The hall was completely silent now. Moments earlier, glasses had clinked, chairs had scraped against the floor, and quiet conversations had filled the room. Now, there was nothing except the steady, powerful sound of the piano. Even the waiters had stopped walking. One stood near the doorway, holding a tray in midair, afraid to make a single noise. At the table where the teasing had begun, the young men sat stiffly. One leaned forward with his elbows on the table, staring at her hands as if trying to understand what he was seeing. Another slowly lowered his phone, which he had lifted at first to record something funny. There was nothing funny about this anymore. Her posture had changed without her realizing it. Her back was straight. Her shoulders were relaxed. Her face was calm. The nervous girl who had walked across the floor minutes ago had disappeared. In her place sat someone steady and sure. She opened her eyes briefly and looked at the keys. The bright lights reflected softly on the smooth black surface of the piano. The sound felt larger now, filling every corner of the room. She could feel the vibration of the lower notes through the bench, through her hands. For a short moment, doubt tried to return. A quiet voice inside her whispered, "What are you doing? This is too much. Stop now." But another voice answered, softer but stronger, "Keep going." Her right hand moved into a faster run of notes. They climbed higher and higher, light and quick, like raindrops falling gently. Her left hand supported the melody with deep, steady chords. The balance between both hands felt natural, as if they were speaking to each other. A woman seated near the front pressed her hand to her chest. She had been smiling earlier during the teasing. Now her eyes were wide with surprise. The man beside her leaned closer and whispered, "Is she a professional?" No one knew. The event manager, who had first approached the scene with concern, now stood near a pillar, completely still. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. He had hired musicians before. He knew the difference between random playing and real skill. What he was hearing was not beginner's luck. The music shifted again. The tempo slowed slightly. The melody became softer, almost fragile. Felt like a quiet confession. Each note seemed to carry a story. It was no longer just about technique. It was about feeling. She remembered something her father once told her. Let the music breathe. So she did. She allowed small pauses between phrases. She did not rush. She trusted the silence as much as the sound. And that silence held the audience captive. One of the young men at the teasing table swallowed hard. He leaned back in his chair, clearly uncomfortable now. What had started as entertainment for him had turned into something else. Something that made him question himself. Across the hall, an older guest who had been checking his watch earlier now placed it back on the table. His eyes did not leave the stage area. He had attended countless formal dinners, heard many performers. Yet this felt different, felt real. Her fingers began to move faster again. This time the melody rose with strength. The notes became bold and confident, echoing through the high ceiling. It was as if she was no longer hiding any part of herself. Her hands crossed briefly over each other, something she had practiced years ago on the old upright piano. The movement was smooth, controlled. A soft murmur of amazement passed through the audience. A phone screen lit up near the back. Someone began recording quietly, careful not to disturb the moment. Soon another screen glowed, then another, but she did not see any of it. Her focus was deep and complete. She was not performing to impress. She was simply telling a story through sound. The melody reached a powerful section, full of emotion. It carried strength and sadness together, like a memory that hurts but also gives comfort. Her fingers pressed the keys with more weight now. The sound was rich and layered. In that moment, anyone listening closely could feel something shift inside them. A young woman near the door wiped a tear from her cheek. She did not know why she was emotional. She had never met the girl at the piano. Yet the music touched something personal. That is what true music does. Connects strangers without words. At the center table, one of the young men finally spoke, his voice low. I didn't expect this. No one answered him. The piece moved toward its most intense section. The tempo increased. Her hands flew across the keys with speed and accuracy. But even in the faster passages, there was control. Nothing sounded messy or rushed. Her heart was beating quickly now, not from fear, but from energy. She felt alive in a way she had not felt in years. The lights above seemed warmer. The room no longer felt intimidating. It felt like a stage she had stepped onto by accident, yet somehow always belonged on. As she approached the final part of the piece, she slowed down again. The melody softened, returning to something gentle and thoughtful. It was like closing a book carefully after reading the last page. Her fingers pressed the final sequence of notes, each one clear and steady. Then came the last chord. It rang through the hall, deep and full. She held it for a second longer, letting the sound settle into the silence. Then she lifted her hands. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No clapping, no whispers, just silence. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of awe. She opened her eyes fully and looked out at the room. Every face was turned toward her. The teasing smiles were gone. The playful expressions had vanished. In their place were wide eyes, raised eyebrows and open mouths. Then, from somewhere near the front, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet hall. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted into applause. It was loud, genuine, and overwhelming. Some guests stood to their feet. Others whistled softly in admiration. The energy that filled the hall now was completely different from before. It was no longer light and careless. It was full of respect. She blinked, slightly stunned. Her hands, which had moved so confidently moments ago, now trembled again. Not from fear, but from emotion. She slowly stood up from the bench. The applause grew even louder. At the teasing table, the young men looked at each other, unsure of what to do. One of them began clapping too, though his face was red with embarrassment. The event manager stepped forward, clapping firmly, his expression proud and amazed at the same time. She gave a small, shy nod toward the audience. Her cheeks warmed under the lights. She had not expected this reaction. She had not expected anything at all. She had only meant to play. As the applause continued, something inside her shifted. For years, she had hidden this part of herself. She had kept it small, private, almost forgotten. Tonight, under bright lights and in front of strangers, it had come alive again, and everyone had seen it. The prank meant to embarrass her had turned into something unforgettable. But more importantly, it had reminded her of something she almost lost. Her music was never meant to stay hidden. The applause did not stop quickly. It rolled through the hall in waves, strong and warm. Some guests were still standing. A few leaned toward each other, speaking with excitement. Others simply kept clapping, as if they did not want the moment to end. She stood beside the piano, unsure of where to look. The bright lights suddenly felt stronger than before. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. Just minutes ago, she had been trying to avoid attention. Now every eye in the room was on her. The event manager was the first to step closer. He had a surprised smile on his face, the kind that appears when someone witnesses something completely unexpected. "That was incredible," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. She lowered her gaze politely. "Thank you," she replied softly. The young men at the center table slowly rose from their seats. Their confident expressions from earlier had disappeared. They did not look amused anymore. They looked small. One of them cleared his throat before speaking. "We didn't know you could play like that." She gave a small nod. She did not know what to say. There was no anger in her face, only calm. Another one rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "We were just joking." She understood that. But something about the way they said it now sounded different. The joke no longer felt funny, even to them. Around them, guests continued talking about the performance. "Did you hear the way she controlled the tempo?" one man said quietly to the person beside him. "It was full of emotion," a woman added. "You could feel every note." Near the back of the hall, someone replayed a short video clip on their phone. The sound of the piano echoed again from the small speaker, and a few people gathered around to watch. The energy in the room had completely changed. Earlier it had been light and careless. Now it felt focused, respectful. The event manager turned to her again. "Where did you train?" he asked. She hesitated for a second. The truth felt simple but also personal. "I didn't," she answered gently. "My father taught me when I was younger." He blinked, clearly surprised. "You never took professional lessons?" She shook her head. A few nearby guests overheard and exchanged amazed looks. The story was becoming even more impressive in their minds. One older guest stepped forward. His voice was calm and thoughtful. "You have natural talent," he said. "But more than that, you have feeling. That cannot be taught easily." Her throat tightened slightly at his words. She remembered those same words spoken years ago in a small living room. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, she wondered if she should quietly return to her duties. After all, she was still working. The trays still needed to be carried. The tables still needed attention. But something was different now. The guests were no longer looking at her as staff. They were looking at her as a musician. The event manager turned toward the audience and raised his hand slightly, asking for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, smiling. "I think we all just witnessed something special tonight." The room responded with another round of applause. He looked back at her. "Would you be willing to play one more piece?" Her heart skipped. One more? The thought both excited and frightened her. The first performance had happened almost by accident. Now this would be intentional. She glanced at the piano. The black surface still shone under the lights. The bench waited quietly. She took a slow breath. "Yes," she said softly. A gentle murmur of anticipation spread through the hall as she returned to the bench. This time her steps felt lighter. There was no teasing voice behind her, no pressure to prove anything. She sat down again and placed her hands on the keys. Before playing, She looked up briefly at the audience. Faces that had once looked amused now looked eager and respectful. She began with a slower melody this time. Something calm, something warm. The room settled instantly. This performance felt different from the first. There was less tension inside her. More freedom. She allowed herself to enjoy the sound fully. As the notes flowed through the hall, people closed their eyes. Some held hands across tables. Others leaned back in their chairs, letting the music wash over them. At the center table, the young men listened quietly. Their earlier laughter felt distant now, almost embarrassing in their memory. One of them leaned forward and whispered, "We really misjudged her." The others nodded. The melody grew brighter, more hopeful, carried a sense of new beginnings. Her fingers moved smoothly, confidently. She no longer felt like she was stepping into someone else's world. She belonged at the piano. When the second piece ended, the applause returned immediately, even louder than before. This time it did not feel overwhelming. Felt earned. As she stood again, the event manager approached her with a thoughtful expression. "I would like to speak with you after the event," he said kindly. "If that's all right." She nodded, unsure what that meant but sensing it was important. Several guests approached her one by one. "You were amazing. Please don't stop playing." That was the highlight of the evening. Each compliment felt unreal. She responded politely, still slightly shy, but something inside her was growing stronger with every word. One woman reached out gently and squeezed her hand. "Your father would be proud," she said without even knowing the full story. Those simple words almost brought tears to her eyes. Across the hall, more phones were out now. Messages were being sent. Videos were being shared quietly among friends. What had begun as a small prank had turned into the main moment of the night. As the event slowly returned to its original schedule, she stepped aside near a quiet corner, giving herself a moment to breathe. Her hands were still slightly warm from playing. She looked down at them and smiled faintly. For years, she had kept this part of herself hidden. She had believed it belonged to the past. Tonight proved otherwise. The event manager joined her again. "Have you ever considered performing professionally?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "I never thought it was possible." He studied her face carefully. Sometimes, possibility just needs the right moment. His words stayed with her. At the center table, one of the young men finally gathered enough courage to approach her. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "We shouldn't have treated you like that." She looked at him calmly. "It's okay," she replied, and she meant it. Because without that moment, without that teasing invitation, she might have never touched the piano tonight. The hall felt different now. Warmer, more connected. People were no longer just guests at a formal event. They had shared something real together. As the evening continued, she returned to her duties, but everything had shifted. Guests smiled at her differently. Some thanked her again as she passed by with a tray. The grand piano no longer looked intimidating in the corner. It looked like an old friend. And deep inside her, something steady and hopeful began to grow. Tonight was not just about surprising a room full of strangers. It was about rediscovering herself. And somewhere in that bright hall filled with applause and unexpected kindness, a new chapter quietly began. The evening slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but nothing felt the same anymore. The music had changed the air in the hall. Conversations were softer, more thoughtful. Guests who had arrived focused on business and status were now talking about emotion, talent, and surprise. She moved between tables again with a tray in her hands, but this time people looked up when she passed. They thanked her. They smiled. A few even stopped her just to say, "You were wonderful." Each word felt warm but also unreal. She kept reminding herself that she was still working. The uniform was the same. The hall was the same. Yet something inside her had shifted. Near the end of the event manager gently motioned for her to step aside for a moment. She placed her tray down carefully and followed him toward a quieter area near the back of the hall. "There's someone who would like to speak with you," he said. Her stomach tightened slightly. She wondered if she had done something wrong. but his expression was calm and encouraging. Standing near one of the tall windows was an older gentleman she had noticed earlier during her performance. He had been seated near the front, watching closely, not distracted like some of the others had been at the start. He turned when he saw her approaching. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said kindly. "No, sir," she replied politely. "I wanted to introduce myself," he continued. "I work with a small music foundation in the city. We support young musicians who have strong potential but limited resources." She listened quietly, unsure where this conversation was going. "What you played tonight," he said, "was not ordinary. It had control, but more importantly, it had heart." Her throat felt dry. Compliments were still hard for her to accept fully. "I only learned from my father," she explained softly. "I never had formal lessons." He smiled gently. "Sometimes that makes the foundation stronger." He asked her a few simple questions. How long had she been playing? Did she still practice regularly? Had she ever considered auditioning for a music program? Each question felt bigger than the last. "I haven't played in front of people in years," she admitted. "Tonight just happened." "Some of the most important moments in life happen that way," he said. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small card with his contact information. "If you're willing," he continued, "I would like to arrange an audition for you. Nothing complicated. Just a small private session. If it goes well, we may be able to offer you proper training. Scholarships. Opportunities to perform." The word scholarship echoed in her mind. For years, music had felt like something she had to leave behind because of money, responsibility, and reality. Now someone was telling her that help might be possible. She held the card carefully, as if it were fragile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Think about it," he replied warmly. "There is no pressure. But talent like yours deserves space to grow." As he stepped away, she stood still for a moment, staring at the small card in her hand. Space to grow. The phrase felt new and unfamiliar. Across the hall, the group of young men who had started everything were preparing to leave. One of them hesitated, then walked toward her once more. "I wanted to say sorry again," he said sincerely. "We thought it would be funny. We didn't expect that." She nodded. "It's all right." "No," he insisted gently. "It's not just all right. We misjudged you, and that's on us." His tone was different now. There was no pride left in it. Only honesty. She gave him a small smile. "Everyone makes mistakes." He looked relieved at her response. "You proved something tonight," he added. "Not just about music. About not judging people too quickly." After he left, she stood quietly, reflecting on his words. Maybe tonight had not only changed her life. Maybe it had changed others too. As the event came to an end and guests slowly exited the hall, several people approached her one last time to thank her again. A few even asked if she had social media where they could follow her music. She felt shy answering those questions. She had never thought of sharing her playing publicly. When the hall finally emptied, the lights were dimmed slightly. The once busy room now felt peaceful. She walked slowly toward the grand piano one more time. It stood alone again, silent and shining. She gently touched the edge of it with her fingertips. "Thank you," she whispered under her breath. Not just to the instrument, but to the moment, to the memory of her father, to the courage that had pushed her to sit down instead of walking away. The event manager approached her again, this time more relaxed. "You handled tonight beautifully," he said. "If you ever want to play at future events here, let me know. We can arrange something properly." She blinked in surprise. "You would allow that?" "Allow it?" He chuckled softly. "After what I heard tonight, I would request it." She smiled. When she finally changed out of her uniform and stepped outside into the cool night air, the world felt different. The streetlights glowed softly. Cars passed by quietly. The city looked the same as it always had. But inside her, something had shifted. She walked home slowly, replaying the evening in her mind. The teasing voices, the first note, the silence, the applause, the card in her pocket. She reached into her coat and touched it again, just to make sure it was real. For years, she had believed her music belonged to the past. Something beautiful but finished. Tonight had shown her that it was not finished. It had only been waiting. When she reached home, she sat quietly at the small table near the window. The house was still. She took out the card and placed it carefully in front of her. Audition, training, opportunity. The words felt both exciting and frightening. Could she really step into that world again? Could she balance responsibility and passion? Could she allow herself to dream without fear of disappointment? She closed her eyes for a moment. In her memory, she saw a small living room. An old upright piano. Patient smile. Don't stop playing. The words echoed gently in her heart. She opened her eyes again. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like a narrow path she had to follow carefully. Felt wider, open. Tonight had started as a prank, but it had ended as something far more important. It had given her back a part of herself she thought she had lost forever. And as she sat there in the quiet room, holding that small card in her hand, she realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes the moment meant to embarrass you becomes the moment that changes your life. The days after the event felt unreal to her. At first, she kept replaying the night in her mind, wondering if she had imagined parts of it. The applause, the second performance, the card now resting safely inside her drawer. Everything had happened so quickly that it almost felt like a dream. But the messages started coming. One of her coworkers had recorded a short video of her playing and shared it privately with a few friends. Within a day, it began circulating beyond the small circle. People were sending kind comments. Some were asking who she was. Others were simply writing how the music made them feel calm. She felt shy seeing her own face on a screen. She was not dressed like a performer. She was wearing a simple uniform, hair tied back, focused only on the keys. Yet the comments were not about her appearance. They were about the emotion in her playing. She did not know how to respond to that kind of attention. A week later, she gathered enough courage to call the number on the small card. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed. The same calm voice answered. "I'm glad you called," the man said warmly after she introduced herself. "We've been waiting." They arranged a private audition at a small music studio across the city. It was nothing like the grand hotel hall. The studio was quiet, with simple white walls and a large piano placed near a window that let in soft daylight. On the morning of the audition, she woke up earlier than usual. Her heart felt heavy with nerves, but there was also excitement underneath. She dressed neatly, not in a uniform this time, but in simple clothes that made her feel comfortable. As she traveled across the city, she looked out the window and thought about how far she had come. Not just physically, but emotionally. When she entered the studio, the room smelled faintly of polished wood. A few people sat near the back with notebooks in their hands. They greeted her kindly. No one looked intimidating. No one looked ready to laugh. Still, her hands felt cold. She sat at the piano and took a slow breath. This time, there was no prank. No pressure from teasing voices. Only a quiet opportunity. She began to play. The notes came softly at first, then stronger as her confidence grew. She played pieces she remembered from childhood, and some she had practiced alone over the years in school auditoriums and borrowed spaces. When she finished, the room remained silent for a moment. But it was a different kind of silence than before. It was thoughtful. One of the panel members smiled gently. "You have not lost anything," he said. "In fact, you have gained depth." Another added, "With proper training, you could go very far." Those words felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. A few days later, she received the call that changed everything. The foundation was offering her a full scholarship, formal training, weekly lessons, access to practice rooms, opportunities to perform at small public events. She sat down slowly after the call ended, trying to absorb it all. For years, music had felt like a closed door. Now someone had opened it wide. Training was not easy. The first few weeks were challenging. She realized how much technique she had missed without formal education. There were corrections to posture, finger placement, timing. Some days she left the studio feeling frustrated. But she did not give up. Every time she felt tired, she remembered the night at the hotel. The silence before the applause. The feeling of belonging at the piano. She practiced harder. Months passed. Her confidence grew. Her skills sharpened. She learned new pieces, explored different styles, and slowly built a small circle of supporters who believed in her. The foundation arranged a small public recital for young musicians. It was nothing grand, just a modest hall with about 100 seats. But to her, it felt like the biggest stage in the world. On the evening of the recital, she stood backstage, listening to the soft murmur of the audience finding their seats. She was not wearing a uniform now. She was dressed as a performer. Her name was printed in the program for the first time. She thought about the journey. The small house, the old upright piano, the loss, the quiet years, the prank, the applause. If someone had told her months ago that her life would look like this, she would not have believed them. Her turn came. She walked onto the stage under warm lights. The applause that greeted her was gentle but respectful. It was not loud like the hotel night. It did not need to be. She sat at the piano. For a second, she closed her eyes. Not from fear, from gratitude. She began to play. This time, every note felt steady. Every movement felt intentional. The music filled the hall slowly, wrapping around the audience like a soft embrace. There were no teasing voices, no doubt, only music. As she reached the final part of her piece, she allowed herself to smile slightly. She was no longer hiding. She was no longer shrinking to make others comfortable. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The final chord echoed beautifully through the hall. When she lifted her hands, the audience rose to their feet. The applause was powerful, but what touched her most were the expressions on their faces. Respect, admiration, inspiration. After the recital, a young girl approached her shyly. "I want to learn piano too," the girl said softly. "But we can't afford lessons." She knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "Don't stop dreaming," she replied gently. "Sometimes the door opens when you least expect it." As she left the hall that night, she thought about how everything had started. With laughter, with a joke meant to embarrass her. If she had walked away that evening, none of this would have happened. But she had chosen to sit down. She had chosen to play. And that simple choice had changed her life. Months later, she returned to the same hotel. Not as staff, but as a guest performer for a special event. The grand piano stood in the same corner, polished and shining under the lights. This time, her name was announced properly. As she walked toward the bench, she noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Even the young men from that first night were there, standing quietly near the back. They clapped sincerely as she sat down. She placed her hands on the keys once more. The first note rang clear and confident. But now it was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about honoring the journey. The prank that once threatened to embarrass her had become the turning point of her life. And as the music filled the hall again, stronger and brighter than before, everyone understood one simple truth. Talent may stay hidden for years, but when courage meets opportunity, it can change everything.